the battle that made the Muslim warriors terrified of the Vikings, 859. In the summer of 859, a line of ships appeared off the Moroccan coast that should not have existed, slicing through the azure waters like scars on perfection. Longships with carved dragon heads, sails striped in foreign colors of blood red and bone white, oars cutting through water that belonged to an entirely different world. Muslim watchtower guards froze, shielding their eyes against the glare, unable to reconcile what their eyes reported with what their minds understood about geography, power, and the natural order of the sea. These were Northmen, Vikings, warriors from cold fjords and mist-covered coasts thousands of miles away, where winter lasted half the year and the sun barely rose. They had no place here in the warm Mediterranean, off the shores of an Islamic emirate that had never faced a northern raid. Yet there they were, shields lined along the gunwales like scales on a serpent, axes resting against the masts, men whose ancestors had never seen Africa, now staring at its walls with hunger in their pale eyes. By the time Nekor's defenders understood the threat, Viking boots were already hitting the beach, sinking into the hot sand. The gates shattered before noon. The palace fell before sunset. And when the longships finally departed, loaded with gold, captives, and plunder, they left behind something far more valuable than what they took. They left terror. A city had been sacked. People had been stunned, and a legend had been born. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Today, we are sailing into the unknown with the most feared raiders in history. We will stand on the deck of a longship as it breaches the Pillars of Hercules, and we will walk the blood-slicked streets of a North African city that never saw the axe coming. We will examine the forensic reality of a clash between two warrior cultures that were never meant to meet, and we will uncover how a single week of violence changed the map of the Mediterranean forever. This is not just a raid, it is a collision of worlds. In the middle of the 9th century, the Mediterranean Sea belonged to the Islamic world in ways that seemed permanent, unquestionable, and divinely ordained. From the Straits of Gibraltar to the coasts of Syria, from the islands of Sicily and Crete to the ports of North Africa, Muslim fleets dominated the waters with a confidence built on centuries of naval superiority. The Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba controlled the western Mediterranean with iron and gold. The Abbasids held the east. Between them, a network of emirates, dynasties, and trading powers maintained order across a sea that had become, for all practical purposes, an Islamic lake. European Christians still held scattered coastal territories, fortified ports, and island strongholds, but their naval power had declined dramatically since the collapse of the Western Roman dollars. Empire. Byzantine fleets occasionally challenged Muslim dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, their Greek fire burning on the waves. Yet, even Constantinople had learned to negotiate carefully with powers that could blockade its trade routes or raid its coasts with devastating efficiency. For the average merchant, sailor, or coastal dweller in 859, the idea that a non-Muslim force could project serious naval power into the heart of the Mediterranean seemed not just unlikely, but absurd. It was into this world of assumed security that the Emirate of Nekor had been built. Nekor sat on the northern coast of Morocco, nestled in the Rif Mountains, where green valleys met the sea in a lush embrace. It was not a massive city, not a center of imperial power, but it was prosperous, a jewel set in the crown of the coast. The emirate controlled fertile agricultural land, managed trade routes connecting the interior of Africa to Mediterranean ports, and served as a hub for merchants moving goods between the Islamic heartlands and the Berber kingdoms to the south. Its markets sold grain, textiles, olive oil, and slaves. Its harbors welcomed ships from Al-Andalus, Ifriqiya, and beyond. The ruling family traced its lineage back to Idris ibn Salih, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hassan. This gave Nekor not just political legitimacy, but religious prestige, a sanctity that should have offered protection. Pilgrims passed through on their way to Mecca. Scholars studied in its mosques. The emir maintained correspondence with other Islamic rulers, paid tribute when necessary, and navigated the complex web of alliances that defined North African politics. What Nekor did not have was a serious navy. The emirate's military strength focused almost entirely on land-based threats, looking inward rather than outward. Berber tribes occasionally challenged its authority with swift cavalry raids. Rival dynasties competed for influence in the surrounding mountains. Bandits raided caravans in the high passes. These were the dangers that shaped Nekor's defenses, the threats that determined where soldiers were stationed, how walls were built, and what kind of warfare its commanders understood. The city had fortifications designed to resist siege engines and cavalry assaults, thick stone walls meant to repel battering rams, not amphibious landings by seaborne raiders who could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. This was not carelessness, it was logic. No northern power had ever launched a sustained naval campaign into the southern Mediterranean. The distance was too great, the logistics were impossible, the risks were overwhelming. Viking raids had become a plague across the Atlantic coasts of Europe. Yes, but those were different waters, different enemies, different strategic calculations. Northmen attacked monasteries along the coasts of Ireland and England. They sailed up rivers into Francia, sacking towns and extracting tribute. They harassed the Iberian kingdoms, testing defenses and seeking plunder, but they did not cross into the Mediterranean. The Straits of Gibraltar formed a natural barrier, a narrow passage where currents ran strong and Muslim fleets patrolled regularly. Any Viking force attempting to enter the Mediterranean would have to navigate those straits under the eyes of Cordoba's navy, risk interception, and then operate thousands of miles from home in hostile waters, surrounded by powers that could mobilize overwhelming force against them. It made no sense. It defied every reasonable assessment of risk and reward. So when the first rumors reached Nekor in the spring of 859, they were dismissed almost immediately. Coastal villages to the west reported sightings of strange ships, not the familiar lateen-rigged vessels of Muslim traders, not the heavy cargo ships that moved goods along established routes, but long, narrow craft with square sails and rows of oars that moved like water insects. The descriptions were vague, the witnesses uncertain, and the reports contradicted each other in key details. Some claimed the ships carried 30 men, others said 100. Some described dragon heads carved into the prows, snarling at the waves. Others mentioned painted shields. Nekor's officials listened politely and did nothing. Strange ships appeared all the time. Smugglers used unconventional vessels. Pirates occasionally tested coastal defenses. Merchants from distant ports brought unfamiliar designs. Without concrete evidence of a threat, without any indication that these sightings represented an organized force, there was no reason to mobilize soldiers, disrupt trade, or create panic over what was most likely a misunderstanding. Then, the reports became more specific, hardening into terrifying clarity. A fishing village near the straits reported that several dozen longships had been seen, moving east along the coast. Not raiding, not attacking, simply sailing with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. The village headman sent word to Nekor, describing the ships in enough detail that the Emir's advisors could no longer dismiss them as merchant vessels or pirates. These were warships, clinker-built hulls designed for speed and aggression, and they were moving deeper into the Mediterranean. By the time Necor's leadership began taking the threat seriously, the window for effective response had already closed. Sending messengers to Cordoba would take days. Mobilizing the Emirates' small fleet would take longer. Coordinating a defensive response with neighboring powers would require negotiations that could stretch into weeks, and all of that assumed the strange ships were actually heading toward Necor rather than toward any of the dozens of other coastal targets they could strike first. The emir made a calculated decision. He ordered the garrison at the coast reinforced with a modest number of additional troops, enough to repel a typical pirate raid, but not so many that it would leave the capital vulnerable to other threats. He sent word to regional allies asking for information about the mysterious fleet. He instructed watchtowers along the coast to maintain constant vigilance and report any further sightings immediately. Then he waited because Necor, like every other Mediterranean power in 859, operated under assumptions that had held true for generations. Distance meant safety. Naval dominance meant control. And Northmen, no matter how fearsome their reputation in the cold Atlantic, simply did not belong in the warm southern waters where Islamic fleets had ruled, unchallenged for centuries. Those assumptions were about to shatter with the sound of splintering wood and the thunder of boots hitting sand. The Vikings, who appeared off Necor's coast in 859, had not arrived by accident or by divine intervention. They had come through careful planning, extraordinary seamanship, and a willingness to take risks that other naval powers considered suicidal. The expedition had begun months earlier, far to the north along the Atlantic coast of Francia. Two commanders led the fleet. Haystein, a veteran raider whose name already carried weight across the Frankish kingdoms, and Bjorn Ironside, a warrior whose lineage connected him to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Together they had assembled 62 longships and recruited thousands of men for a campaign that promised wealth beyond anything the raided-out coasts of northern Europe could offer. By 859, the Viking world faced a strategic problem. For decades, Norse raiders had extracted enormous wealth from monasteries, towns, and kingdoms across Britain, Ireland, and Francia, but success had brought diminishing returns. Coastal settlements had learned to build defenses. Armies had adapted their tactics. Kings had organized rapid response forces. The element of surprise that had made early Viking raids so devastating had eroded through repetition. Wealthy targets still existed, but they were increasingly fortified, increasingly prepared, and increasingly expensive to attack in terms of Viking casualties. The North Sea and the Atlantic coasts had become saturated with raiders competing for the same plunder. Some Viking leaders responded by pushing further into river systems, sailing deep into Francia to strike inland targets. Others turned to settlement, claiming land and transforming from raiders into rulers. Haystein and Bjorn chose a different path. They would go where no Viking fleet had gone before. The Mediterranean represented everything the northern world was not: warmth instead of cold. Wealth concentrated in undefended coastal cities rather than scattered across fortified monasteries. Trade routes thick with merchant vessels carrying silk, spices, gold, and slaves. And perhaps most importantly, shores that had never seen a Viking longship, coasts, where the mere appearance of Norse warriors would create the kind of psychological shock that had made early raids in Britain so profitable. The expedition's first challenge was reaching the Mediterranean at all. The Straits of Gibraltar had a reputation among sailors. Currents moved with brutal force. Winds shifted unpredictably. Rocks lurked beneath the surface near both shores. Muslim fleets from Cordoba patrolled the waters regularly, watching for Christian raiders or pirates who might threaten trade routes. For a fleet of 62 longships, each carrying 40 to 50 warriors plus supplies, The straits represented a choke point where the entire expedition could be detected, intercepted, and destroyed. Hastings understood this. Rather than attempting a direct crossing, the fleet first struck targets along the Iberian coast, testing Muslim defenses and gathering intelligence about patrol patterns. They raided small ports, captured fishing vessels, and interrogated sailors who knew the currents and the schedules of Cordoba's warships. What they learned was that Muslim naval power, while dominant, was not omnipresent. Patrol routes followed predictable patterns. Gaps existed. The Vikings waited for the right conditions, then made their move. Under cover of darkness and favorable winds, the fleet passed through the straits in 859, not all at once, but in smaller groups, spread across several nights, reducing the chance of detection. By the time Cordoba's coastal watchers realized that a major northern fleet had entered the Mediterranean, the longships were already dispersed, moving east along the African coast toward targets whose names the Vikings had learned from captured merchants. The crossing itself demonstrated something that Mediterranean powers had not fully appreciated about Norse seamanship. Viking longships were not clumsy northern vessels designed only for river raids and coastal attacks. They were sophisticated, ocean-going craft, built by cultures that had navigated the North Atlantic, reached Iceland, and explored waters far more dangerous than the Mediterranean. Their shallow draft allowed them to beach on almost any coastline. Their speed under oar or sail gave them tactical mobility that heavier Muslim warships could not match, and their crews possessed navigational knowledge accumulated over generations of long-distance voyaging. Once inside the Mediterranean, the fleet operated with calculated aggression. They struck the Balearic Islands first, testing how quickly Muslim forces could respond to raids and learning how coastal defenses were organized. The attacks served multiple purposes. They gathered plunder to sustain the expedition. They refined Viking tactics for Mediterranean conditions. And they created confusion about the fleet's true intentions and destination. Muslim authorities issued warnings. Coastal cities received orders to increase vigilance. Naval patrols intensified in areas where the Vikings had been sighted. But the Mediterranean was vast, and tracking 62 longships that could move independently, beach on remote shores, and avoid major shipping lanes proved nearly impossible with the communication and coordination systems available in 859. Meanwhile, Neckor remained largely unaware of the developing threat. The Emirates' intelligence network focused primarily on land-based dangers, rival dynasties, Berber tribal movements, caravan security. Information from the sea came slowly, filtered through merchant reports and occasional messages from other ports. By the time word reached Neckor that Viking ships had entered the Mediterranean and raided the Balearics, weeks had already passed. By the time the emir's advisors debated whether this posed a direct threat to their own coast, the longships were already moving south. Hastings had chosen his target carefully. Neckor offered several advantages. It was wealthy enough to make the raid profitable, but not so heavily defended that it would require a prolonged siege. Its location on the Moroccan coast placed it outside the immediate response range of major Muslim naval powers. The city's defenses were oriented toward land threats, not seaborne assault. And perhaps most importantly, sacking an Islamic emirate on the North African coast would send a message that would echo across the entire Mediterranean world. The Vikings were no longer northern barbarians, confined to cold seas and river raids. They were a force that could strike anywhere without warning, without regard for the assumed boundaries that separated Christian Europe from the Islamic Mediterranean. As the fleet approached the Moroccan coast, Neckor's watchtowers finally spotted them. Dozens of ships with striped sails and shield-lined gunwales moving with the disciplined, coordination of an organized military force. Messengers rode hard toward the capital, carrying news that should have been impossible. Northmen, Vikings, here, off the shores of an African emirate, thousands of miles from their homeland. The emir called his council. They discussed options with the frantic energy of men who had just realized their defensive assumptions had been completely wrong. Should they attempt negotiations? Should they mobilize the entire garrison to the coast? Should they send urgent requests for help to Cordoba, to neighboring emirates, to anyone who might respond in time? The debate consumed hours. The Vikings consumed the distance to shore in a single night. By dawn, on the day that would define Necor's history, Haystein's fleet was beaching on the sand, not tentatively, not cautiously, but with the confident aggression of raiders who had crossed an ocean, navigated hostile waters, and sailed past every defensive barrier that was supposed to keep them out. The longships hit the beach in waves. Warriors poured over the sides, forming shield walls with practiced efficiency, even as their boots sank into unfamiliar sand. The sound of it carried across the water and up the slopes toward the city, the rhythmic thunder of oars being shipped, the scrape of keels on sand, the shouts of commanders organizing their forces in a language Necor's defenders had never heard spoken by an enemy. Necor's coastal garrison numbered a few hundred men. They had prepared for pirates or small raiding parties, not for an army. They formed defensive lines, called for reinforcements, and attempted to hold the approaches to the city. But the numbers were wrong. The tactics were wrong. Everything about this attack contradicted their training and experience. The Vikings came ashore like a tide that could not be stopped. And behind them, still visible on the horizon, more ships waited, more warriors, more proof that distance had stopped meaning anything, that safety was an illusion, and that the Mediterranean's assumed order was about to be rewritten in the sand. And blood of an emirate that had made the fatal mistake of believing geography would protect. The assault on Necor began with the kind of methodical violence that separated organized Viking armies from simple raiders. 3,000 warriors hit the beach in coordinated waves. The first groups formed shield walls immediately, creating defensive positions that protected subsequent landings. Archers moved into position behind them, providing covering fire for units advancing inland. Commanders shouted orders in Old Norse, organizing their forces with the efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times before across a dozen different coastlines. Necor's garrison met them on the slopes leading up from the harbor, a few hundred defenders against thousands of attackers. The mathematics alone made the outcome inevitable. But what shattered Necor's resistance was not just the numbers, it was the alien nature of the threat itself. The city soldiers had trained to fight Berber cavalry, to defend against siege engines, to hold walls against armies that approached warfare with familiar tactics and predictable patterns. They had never faced shield walls that moved like single organisms, locking together to form an impenetrable barrier of wood and iron. They had never encountered the particular ferocity of Norse warriors who fought with axes designed to shatter shields and pull down defenders, their bearded faces painted for war. They had never experienced the psychological weight of facing an enemy whose language, appearance, and fighting style belonged to an entirely different world. The Vikings advanced upslope in tight formations. Arrows from Necor's walls struck shields and occasionally found gaps, but not enough to slow the assault. When the defenders attempted to countercharge, hoping to use momentum and local knowledge of the terrain to disrupt the attackers, they crashed into shield walls that absorbed the impact and then pushed back with overwhelming force. The first defensive line broke within an hour. Survivors fell back toward the city's outer walls, hoping that stone fortifications would provide the advantage that open ground had denied them. The emir's commanders sent messengers racing through the streets, calling every available man to the defenses. Merchants grabbed weapons. Craftsmen reported to their assigned positions. Even religious scholars who normally avoided violence took up positions on the walls, understanding that this was not a raid that could be bought off with tribute or negotiated away with diplomacy. The Vikings reached the gates before Neckar could fully organize its interior defenses. What happened next demonstrated why Norse raiders had become the terror of coastal Europe. The attackers did not attempt a traditional siege. They did not settle in for weeks of starvation tactics or wait for disease to weaken the Bale defenders. Instead, they brought tools they had carried on their ships specifically for this purpose: axes, hammers, and a small battering ram that required only a dozen men to operate effectively. The gates of Neckar had been built to resist the kind of siege equipment that Berber armies might bring overland. Heavy timber reinforced with iron bands set into stone walls that rose 2 stories high. Impressive defenses against traditional threats. But Viking axes were not traditional weapons. They were designed to split wood, to tear through ship hulls, to destroy obstacles quickly so that raids could maintain their speed and shock value. Teams of warriors attacked the gates in rotation. One group would strike for several minutes, then fall back while fresh fighters took their place. The sound of it echoed through the city, the relentless thunder of metal on wood, the splintering of timber, the shouted coordination of men who understood that speed was as much a weapon as strength. Defenders on the walls above poured arrows down, dropped stones, tried to pour heated oil through murder holes. Some Vikings fell, others were wounded, but the assault continued without pause. And the gates that had never been breached by any Berber force began to show cracks, then gaps, then finally gave way entirely in a cascade of shattered timber and torn iron. The Vikings poured through. Street fighting in Neckar became a nightmare of close-quarters chaos. The city's narrow lanes, which should have favored defenders who knew every alley and courtyard, instead became killing grounds where Viking small unit tactics proved devastatingly effective. Norse warriors operated in groups of 10 to 20 men, each unit moving with coordinated discipline through unfamiliar streets, using their shields to create mobile walls that protected them from flank attacks, while their axes and swords cleared resistance with brutal efficiency. Neckar's defenders fought building by building, trying to slow the advance through sheer determination. Some barricaded themselves in mosques and homes, forcing the Vikings to clear each structure individually. Others attempted ambushes from rooftops and side streets. A few units managed organized counterattacks that briefly pushed the invaders back. None of it mattered, not strategically. The Vikings had numerical superiority, tactical experience, and most importantly, momentum. They were not trying to hold territory. They were not attempting to govern the city or win hearts. They were there to take what they wanted and leave, which meant they could afford to be ruthless in ways that defenders trying to protect their homes could not. By midday, Viking forces had reached the palace. The emir's personal guard made their stand on the palace steps. These were professional soldiers, better trained and equipped than the city garrison, men who had protected the ruling family for years and understood that surrender meant shame and possible execution. They formed a tight defensive line, spears and swords ready, determined to sell their lives expensively. Hasstein himself led the assault on the palace. He understood the symbolic importance of capturing the emir, the value it would add to the raid's profitability, and the message it would send across the Mediterranean. The fighting on the palace steps was hand-to-hand, vicious and brief. Viking numbers and aggression overwhelmed courage. When the doors finally gave way, Haystein's warriors swept through the interior, hunting for the prize that would transform this raid from merely successful to legendary. They found the emir in his private chambers, surrounded by family and advisors who had nowhere left to retreat. No dramatic last stand, no defiant speech, just the cold reality of a ruler who had run out of options, confronting warriors who held his life in their hands. The Vikings did not kill him. Dead emirs could not pay ransoms. With the palace secured and the emir captive, organized resistance in Nekor collapsed. Scattered pockets of defenders continued fighting, some out of loyalty, others out of desperation, a few simply because they had nowhere to run. But the battle was effectively over. What followed was not combat, but extraction. The Vikings moved through the city with systematic efficiency, targeting the places where wealth concentrated. The palace treasury was emptied first. Gold, silver, jewelry, anything portable and valuable. Then the markets, where merchants kept reserves of goods and coin. Then the mosques, where religious endowments and donations had accumulated over decades. Then the homes of wealthy families who had not managed to flee or hide their valuables in time. Captives were selected with equal calculation. The emir and his immediate family were the most valuable prizes, worth enormous ransoms. But the Vikings also took merchants who could be exchanged for gold, craftsmen whose skills might be useful, and young people who could be sold as slaves in markets across the Viking world. They were not indiscriminate. Every captive represented food consumed and space occupied on the voyage home. Only those who added value were taken. The loading process took hours. Warriors formed human chains from the city to the beach, passing bundles of plunder hand to hand until the longships' holds began to fill. Other Vikings maintained security, patrolling the streets to prevent counterattacks and making sure no organized Nekor force could threaten the evacuation. By late afternoon, Hastings gave the order to withdraw. The Vikings pulled back in organized stages, maintaining defensive formations until the last warriors reached the beach. Then they pushed their ships back into the water with the same coordinated discipline they had shown during the landing. Oars slid into position, sails rose, and the fleet that had appeared impossibly on Nekor's horizon began to pull away, their holds packed with treasure, their decks crowded with captives. Their reputation now expanded to include something that no Muslim power had thought possible. They had crossed the Mediterranean. They had sacked an Islamic emirate on African soil, and they had done it with casualties that barely registered against their total force. Behind them, Nekor burned in scattered places where fighting had spread fire. Survivors emerged from hiding, moving through streets littered with the debris of shattered defenses. Some searched for family members. Others simply stared at the destruction, trying to process what had happened in less than a day. The city's walls still stood. Most buildings remained intact. The population had not been slaughtered. In purely physical terms, Nekor would recover. But something else had been destroyed that morning. Something that would take far longer to rebuild than walls or markets. The assumption of safety, the belief that geography provided protection, the confidence that Islamic naval dominance made the Mediterranean's southern shores untouchable by northern barbarians. As the sun set on that summer day in 859, the longships disappeared over the horizon, carrying with them not just gold and captives, but proof that the world had changed. That distance meant nothing. That reputation meant nothing. That no coast, no matter how far from Viking homelands, could consider itself beyond their reach. If you want to explore more topics on history and uncover the untold stories of the past with medieval spirits, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more insights.